The rental assistance program in Minnesota rewarded tenants for bad behavior. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, so I have an interesting article for you today, and it's going over the trouble that landlords had with the rental assistance program in the state of Minnesota. Now, I know this is about one specific rental assistance program, but these same problems were happening all over the country, not just in that state, but you can go anywhere, the Midwest, the South, the Northeast, the West Coast, and all of these rental assistance programs were having the same problems. So this should tell you that, hey, these programs, they do not work, okay? They were supposed to be put in place for temporary relief for landlords who are suffering under the eviction moratoriums. But what happened was the eviction moratorium and the rental assistance programs were tied together. And that meant that landlords were unable to evict tenants, and they should have been able to evict them because a lot of tenants, they just didn't apply for rental assistance. They didn't care. They didn't care if the landlord got any of the money that was owed to them, just as long as they didn't lose their personal housing. So then as the eviction moratorium started coming to an end, all of a sudden then they were applying, and then the local governments were putting in these protections saying, hey, landlords can't evict if this tenant even applied, even if they didn't qualify, even if they waited for 12, 15 months plus, we still couldn't evict at that point. So yeah, a lot of landlords got super duper frustrated, especially the landlords in this article, and I don't blame them one bit. Now, before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button if you haven't already. Maybe leave a comment down below and let me know. I'm just curious, how many people who are watching this video right now actually applied and received rental assistance through their state's rental assistance program, okay? I'm just curious, was this something that was common? And if you did receive it, were you able to get compensated all of the money that you were owed? From what I've heard from a lot of people commenting on my other videos is that they weren't able to get all the money back that they were owed, and they ended up not ever being made whole. So, that's part of the reason why I'm not a proponent of these programs. Now, this article is coming from postbulletin.com, and it says, program to halt evictions not paying off for area landlords. Rent Help MN is designed to pay landlords whose tenants cannot pay rent due to a change in their financial situation because of COVID-19. Let's see what it says. Lana and Travis Heumann said they'll gladly accept the consequences of a poor decision, but when those consequences are foisted upon them by the state, the husband and wife have a problem. Right now, they have a problem with Rent Help MN, a state program designed to help renters who are facing tough financial times because of a change in employment during the COVID-19 pandemic. The Humans, who have about 20 rental properties spread across Goodhue County, are dealing with a big debt because the state program, they said, didn't give them any rent recourse when a tenant in the city of Goodhue decided to stop paying her rent, but also wouldn't work with them to get payments from the state. And that's the issue that a lot of landlords faced. In order for a landlord to get rental assistance, the tenant had to be actively participating in the program. Now, I know a few states actually have corrected that, and the problem is, though, that wasn't the case in all the states, and it looks like that wasn't the case here in Minnesota. So if you have a tenant for whatever reason, be it that they're lazy, be it that they don't get along with the landlord, be it that, they want to purposefully spite the landlord, or they just don't care, then they don't apply for the rental assistance. The landlord can't get it. Yet at the same time, the landlord cannot evict that tenant. Okay, so the landlord's just screwed. Even if the person does actually qualify for the rental assistance, there's nothing that they can do. So, that was the huge problem. They made it seem as though, hey, the tenant is the one who is suffering the financial burden, so the tenant is the one who needs to apply for this rental assistance, when the truth of the matter is the landlord is the one suffering the financial burden. The tenant is getting a free housing, from the government, or not from the government, but on the back of the landlord. If they get rental assistance, then they're getting the free housing on the back of the government. But, either way, the tenant isn't paying jack, and the tenant gets free housing out of it. Now the couple is out $4,300 in rent, plus another $1,900 in cleaning fees and overdue utilities on one unit. And they're not the only ones facing lost income due to a program that gives little power to landlords and leaves them with few options. Whew, yeah, and that might not seem like a lot of money, okay, to some people. But keep in mind, okay, if these are small landlords, they don't own thousands and thousands of properties. And here they are on one unit where they weren't paid the rent and where they had to get the place cleaned up after this tenant finally was able to move out and pay all the back utilities and everything. And they're out, over 6,000, let's see what it is, $6,200, okay? Out $6,200 for one unit. Now, imagine if just, you lose 10% of your income and that 10% was the usual profit that you make in an entire year. Well, you're completely screwed, okay? That's why I say, you got to really, really understand how business works, how the math behind all of this works. And if you're not a landlord, if you're not a business owner, you don't understand. You think the landlord can just swallow these costs, and they just can't do it. Working the system. State Representative Barb Haley, Republican from Red Wing, called the program ineffective and said the legislation creating it was poorly written, giving landlords almost no power when tenants decided during the pandemic to stop paying their rent. By the time someone has called me, they're beyond frustrated at that point, Haley said. Haley has had several constituents call her asking for help getting paid from Rent Help MN. She said she's been able to help a few landlords get their money, but in each case, it's taken several months. A big part of the problem, she added, is that the vendor who was hired to manage the program was overwhelmed and even fired by other states it was helping with similar programs. So yeah, they have a vendor who obviously caught up in all of the bureaucracy and all the paperwork and everything, was taking longer than necessary in order to get those payments out to landlords. So landlords were sitting there suffering, losing their properties, their business, losing a ton of money. And these people weren't even doing right. So yeah, we've got a bad situation that landlords were put in. And I hate the fact that I'm still talking about this. Here we are, it's January of 2022, okay? The eviction moratorium from the CDC ended back in August of 2021. Some states put in, additional eviction protections for their tenants, and they're finally coming to an end. But the landlords, all we wanted was to be made whole by these rental assistance programs, and it just hasn't happened. It has been a complete disaster from the beginning. That's why these things should have never been put into place in the first place. Now, if they had introduced the rental assistance and didn't have an eviction moratorium tied to it and just said, hey, these tenants are going to lose their home. So as the government, they had stepped up and said, hey, we're going to pay the landlords directly. No tenants involved. All the landlord has to do is submit basic paperwork saying that their tenants stopped paying rent. Then I would have been okay with that, okay? But instead, they put all these stipulations, all this paperwork required, all these hoops you have to jump through. You've got ridiculous people who just, don't want to cooperate, don't want to participate, want to screw the landlords over, don't care. And, this is where we end up right here. And this is awful. So I'm going to skip down a little bit in this story. Go on to one of the further paragraphs. Reward for bad behavior. Lana Human says she's given up trying to get money from Rent Help MN. Part of the problem, she said, is the rules seem to have changed in the middle of the process, and that has left their business out in the cold. The tenant in question, she said, did not pay her rent because she lost her job from March to September. She was eventually evicted, not for non-payment of rent, but for presenting an imminent threat to others in the building. Minnesota Housing cited the fact that the renter no longer lived there as a reason for denial of the rent application. Yeah, can you imagine that? Basically, you have a tenant who is protected by the eviction moratorium, right? You're finally able to get that tenant out of the property, whether they leave on their own or you're get them evicted for a reason other than non-payment of rent. And then they tell you, well, we can't approve your application because they don't live in your property anymore. It's like, yeah, but that doesn't change the fact that I let them live in my property for 6 months or however many months without paying rent because of the eviction moratorium. So the government should reimburse me like they said they would, but they're not going to. Otherwise, you should have been able to evict from the very beginning. So they created this situation. Landlords are the ones who are paying the price, unfortunately. And Minnesota is one of those places right now where I wouldn't want to invest anyway, because, I've read about the new rent control law up in St. Paul and how they're trying to pass rent control in Minneapolis as well. And it seems like it's just getting further and further, anti-landlord on one side and pro-tenant. And it's just becoming a worse and worse place to invest. Maybe it's not so outside of the Twin Cities, but, for now, I just would say I wouldn't invest there.